Hello, I'm here with another book tag video. This is the Big Books tag, which Jasmine on her booktube channel, she tagged me in recently. So I'll link that below as well as the original creator of this tag. And it's a very simple tag. It's just five books, five of the biggest books on my shelf, which I've read, and then two books which I haven't read. So I was a bit unsure whether I should make this tag because I've made a couple of videos now talking about big books, but then I thought, during this time when a lot of us are spending a lot of time inside, we like bigger books to dive into and get sort of lost in. So I thought this might give some more suggestions of big books that you might want to read. But I'm going to slightly cheat with this video in that these aren't necessarily the biggest books on my shelves. They're just quite big books on my shelf because I've made videos talking about big books recently. I don't want to be repetitive and talk about the same ones over again. So I've chosen different ones, which I haven't really talked about as much recently, or if at all. So just to make it more fun, I thought I would vary it up like that. So first off is the collected stories of Eudora Welty, because obviously it's not all novels that are big books on my shelves. She wrote quite a lot of stories. So this book is 622 pages long, and I think I've read all of the stories in this collection over probably many years, and that's one of the good things about short story collections is it can just sort of sit on your shelf. You can go back to it every now and then and read another story. So even if you don't want to dive into a full-on big commitment that a long novel takes, you can sort of just enjoy a story or two here and there, just as something to concentrate on that's outside of everything that's happening in the world right now. And these stories are really clever and intelligent and beautifully written, and so she was a writer of the American South, and she writes quite often about Southern characters, really psychologically insightful stories. I think that she's really famous for. So I really enjoy this collection, and this is the Virago edition, which has this great photo on the cover that I really like. Then I have the collected poems of Emily Dickinson, which is obviously a very big book because she wrote a lot. She's famous for writing these very sparse, very short, sort of cryptic poems that could have a lot of meaning, and they're the sort of poems that you have to, I think, really sit with and think about for a long time before the manifold meanings of all of the poems can kind of open up to you. So this book totals 770 pages, and I would say I probably haven't read all of the poems, but I do dip into it every now and then to read a poem or two and then just think about the meaning. And then I think some of the poems, are much more famous poems of hers that I've read multiple times. So this is a book that's sat on my shelf for many, many years and that I just keep dipping in and out of. Then I have the collected stories of W. Somerset Maugham in this beautiful Everyman's edition of the book. So this totals at 839 pages. And I think I have read all of these short stories over a long period of time. I dedicated myself to reading a short story every day, which is a lovely thing to do, to start your day first thing in the morning to read a short story and just get a little snippet of an alternative world. And I like how W. Somerset Maugham, somebody famously said that he's the best of the second-rate writers, which is a really catty, really shady thing to say about somebody, about a writer. But yeah, I think his stories often portray the complicated relationships between people, sometimes in foreign countries, and I really enjoy his short stories, and I want to read more of his novels. I think I've only read The Moon and Sixpence and maybe one other novel of his, but he wrote some very not long novels as well. And during his day, during the early 20th century, when I think he was writing, he was one of the most successful writers of his day. And and I think he's a really great writer. He's not just the best of the second rate. He's a really great writer in himself. And then there's a novel which is much talked about on BookTube here, A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. And some people say that you have extreme reactions to this novel. You either love it or you hate it. But I'm one of those rare people who sort of fall in the middle. I appreciate certain aspects of it, but there are other parts of it which sort of annoy me. And but mainly, I just love this novel as a portrayal of friendship over time and how there are aspects to the closest friends of our life which we may not be aware of, and we might sort of consciously avoid talking about those things because they're things that we've never talked about with our friends, because over time, we with certain friends, we can only talk about certain subjects with them, and other subjects become almost off limits in a strange way, even though you would think if you're such good friends you could talk about everything. But yeah, I think that's a strange thing about friendship over time, and I haven't read many other books that portray this subject in such a strong way as this novel does. And and it clocks in at 720 pages, so it's quite a long novel in itself. Then I have Joyce Carol's novel Blonde, which is 738 pages. This beautiful edition of the novel. And it's one of my favorite books of all time. I love so much, and my favorite author of all time. And of course, I talk about Joyce Carol all the time. And but yeah, I think this novel is brilliant in a portrayal of Norma Jean Baker, the inner life of the woman who became Marilyn Monroe, and the whole psychological process of how you can lose yourself in fame, and the blondness of her that she's famous for as that image of Marilyn Monroe, how she becomes sort of lost in that, loses her an essential part of herself in sort of performing this character of Marilyn Monroe. And her portrayal of that is so epic, of how she shows that psychological process. I think it's just brilliant. And yeah, I love this novel so much. And it's a very difficult thing to do, because obviously she's such a famous person. She's that some people take this almost as like a biography of Marilyn Monroe, but it's really not that at all. It's really showing that psychological process. And it's almost like a Dickensian story of how she's somebody who comes from nothing and then becomes one of the most famous people in the world. She's like literally born into an orphanage or is raised in an orphanage, and then, becomes this mega celebrity, one of the most famous people of the 20th century. And yeah, so I think it's an amazing novel. And I was chatting recently in the comments with Greg on his YouTube channel, Supposedly Fun, how this is going to be made into a movie soon, and it was actually already made into a TV movie, which wasn't all that good, but it's been made into a movie again, and is going to be a sort of bigger budget movie, and which I think is really going to be such a tricky thing to do, because I don't see how you can film a movie which doesn't come across as just like a biopic, because that's really not what this novel is. And so to capture the psychological intensity of the novel in a movie is going to be a really difficult thing. But maybe it'll come across well. There's certain books like The Hours by Michael Cunningham, which I thought would be unfilmable, but was made into a beautiful movie. So you never know; it might surprise you. And then for two of the biggest books on my shelves that I have read, I'm two of the biggest books definitely that I've read recently is Wolf Hall, and then this one, Quack Quack. But I've talked about these books so much recently, I feel like I don't really need to talk about them again, even though this was definitely my favorite book that I read last year, so would highly recommend it. So I'll put a link to my review to it down below, and also the whole video I made about it. So if you want to find out more of my thoughts about it. But yeah, just like I said, I feel like I've talked about it so much recently, I don't need to talk about those books anymore. And then big book on my shelf I have to read very soon is the third book in the trilogy of The Mirror and the Light, which clocks in at a huge amount. How long is this novel? It's 883 pages. Yeah, so That's going to take up a lot of my time. But yeah, just because I haven't talked about it as much, there's Joyce Carol Oates' forthcoming novel, Night, Sleep, Death, the Stars, which comes in 789 pages. I think it might be her longest novel of all time, and it's supposed to be amazing. So I'm very much looking forward to this. And then finally, final book on my shelf that I don't think I've talked about at all is Thomas Pynchon's novel Against the Day. So this is 1,085 pages long. It depicts a period in the early 20th century in America. I think, yeah, starting with the Chicago World's Fair, or the very end of the 19th century, and then early into the 20th century in America. And Thomas Pynchon is a writer. I'm not sure I'm gonna enjoy him or like his writing all that much. I read a very short novel of his before, which is probably the one that a lot of people read by Thomas Pynchon because it's short, whereas a lot of his other books like Gravity's Rainbow and this novel are very, very long. And yeah, it's just, I think, a very dense prose style. So I'm not sure I'm going to get along with it. But, I keep it on my shelf and in the hope that maybe one day I might try it and, maybe I'll love it. I like to keep an open mind. So, you never know. I might really come to love this book if I ever actually get around to reading it. So those are some of the biggest books on my shelf. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know your thoughts on them. Let me know some of the biggest books on your bookshelf. Let me know the titles below and the page numbers of the ones both that you've read and the ones that you haven't read. It'd be really interesting to know if you think, because there's this big debate about big books, do the length of these books really are they justified in having so many pages to them, this is a complicated way of saying, do you think that these books really justify their page length? And and with most of these, I think they really do. I mean, obviously with poems and short stories, it's quite a different thing, but with novels, you could say, like, does it really justify its length? And just the extent that this novel goes to in betraying this one character's downward spiral and how he cannot be saved is, I think, really justifies its length. And in the same way, Blonde, I think the way it shows the evolution of her life and her character over time in this descent, moving from this realist style to it comes almost dreamlike and hallucinatory in the style of its narration as she comes to lose herself in this character of Marilyn Monroe. I think this novel really does justify its length. So yeah, I think quite a lot of books do, but then some definitely don't. I can think of some big books which could have been edited down a bit more. So yeah, let me know in the comments if you think that there are some books which really stand out as examples of big books that justify their lengths, and then other books which really didn't need to be as long as they are, and if they were just have a lot of filler, which probably could have been cut out and not have detracted from the overall feeling of the book. Yeah, that would be interesting. So yeah, let me know all that in the comments below and we can have a chat. And yeah, I will speak to you again soon. Take care, everyone.